Hey, Tolkien Poppers. This episode is sponsored by Theology Beer Camp 2026. And Theology Beer Camp is just an awesome place where philosophers, theologians, and various types of pop culture nerds have been meeting on a yearly basis. And it is an awesome event organized by Trip Fuller from Homebrewed Christianity. And if you have heard me on the podcast or been a part of the Tolkien Heads class or even seen some of my writing, you know that bringing together niche philosophy, theology, and Tolkien is part of my whole thing. And that will be present at Theology Beer Camp too. So there'll be links in the show note, but get your tickets for Theology Beer Camp 2026. It will be in Kansas City, Missouri on October 8th through October 10th. Hope to see you there. What up, Tolkien Poppers? It's Nick here with another episode of the podcast where I get to sit down with the Reverend Dr. Tom Emanuel. And if you've done anything with me online with Tolkien, you may remember him from the Tolkien Heads class I did with Trip Fuller. And part of the reason why we're sitting down with Tom this time for an interview is because Tom recently wrapped up his PhD at the University of Glasgow, where he studied Tolkien fans in a sort of post-religious ethnography about their pseudo-religious involvement with Tolkien fandom. So it's super cool. We touch on that. We get a little bit of Tom's Tolkien experience. We talk about some progressive theology within Tolkien Studies without. And we just get into a bunch of really nerdy theological, religious studies, and philosophical takes on Tolkien. So if you like this sort of thing, which, you know, if you're here, I think you do, you will really enjoy this conversation with Tom. So sit back, relax, and like always, enjoy this conversation, and I will catch you all later. What up, Tolkien Poppers? This is Nick here with another episode of the podcast where I am excited to host, at least here in the podcast space for the first time, the Reverend Dr. Tom Emanuel. And I'm just excited, Tom. If you're familiar with Tom, Tom has been involved with a lot of things. Like, we've collaborated. Tom was on the Tolkien Heads class back in the COVID times. And I think that we've done some other stuff online, Tom. But anyway, before we get into that and I get ahead of myself, how are you? And, you know, thanks for coming on.
Hey Nick, thanks for having me. It is a delight to be here. Yeah, I feel we've orbited around one another in sort of progressive, radical, theological Tolkien space for years now, and had a lot of conversations, both in writing and over video. I'm really looking forward to, being able to have an extended one now, and also I hope see you in person at some point now that we're back in the same country again.
Seriously, 100%. You know, maybe at a Westmoot or something. I went to last year's and I wasn't able to make it to this one's, but maybe that, or even Theology Beer Camp. I don't know. We kind of both dabble in both those worlds.
Oh, that's true. That's true. See, there's so many exciting possibilities now that I have finished my doctorate.
Yeah, dude.
There are a lot of opportunities and possibilities open up that weren't there when I was knee deep, or should say neck deep, in theology PhD world.
Yeah, you actually have a lot more free time now. Yeah, yeah.
We'll see about that, but different kinds of free time.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it's been since like what, 21 maybe, I think is how long, like way back when we talked. So it has literally been half a decade that we've been orbiting and talking to each other on and off here.
That is correct. I think, I started getting serious about my PhD research about wanting to do doctoral work on Tolkien about 5 years ago. And I think we must have started running in the same online circles just around that time. I think it was as I was looking for other people who were theologically progressive and who were progressive more generally and into Tolkien, and finding them on the site formerly known as Twitter, that you and I started coming into contact with one another.
Man, the website formerly known as Twitter, weird times, man. It feels like a fever dream. So you mentioned your doctorate, and so that was a recent thing. So could you, for those of us who don't know you, or new listeners who don't know you or your work, like, could you tell us about your recent PhD acquirement, and then even who you are and what you are doing?
Sure. So, as both Nick and I have alluded to at this point, I recently completed my doctorate in English literature and theology at the University of Glasgow. The thesis, my research title was The Tale We've Fallen Into, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and the Post-Christian Quest for Meaning, which was a study of the reception of the Lord of the Rings among non-religious readers. That is the dry way of describing what ultimately became a examination of my relationship to the Lord of the Rings as a one-time non-religious person who then, we might say, got Jesus in adulthood, became a progressive religious leader and theologian, ended up getting a PhD about Tolkien, but also the role of the Lord of the Rings in the lives of 20 non-religious interviewees, a study of the development of Western religion in modernity and exercise in post-positivist qualitative interview-based research, a good bit of theologizing and literary theorizing on the side. So it became, to say that it's a reception study does feel a little like the abstract to a thing that is a good deal more concrete and meaty, that has a lot more meat to it than what that might suggest. But I just finished that up after having been a lifelong Tolkien fan. And when I say a lifelong, I do mean lifelong, since before I can even remember. And having been in Tolkien scholarship world for on and off for about a decade, but really consistently for the last 5 years.
Yeah, man. Oh, I love that. When you bring up religion and theology and Tolkien, and then personal experience, and then the whole, losing faith and coming back to it, or whatever you want to call it, and Tolkien was kind of that person who sort of brought me back into creating a sort of theological meaning in when I kind of lost faith in that time. So, yeah, dude, that's just, it's rad. Obviously, we talked about the theology and Tolkien very briefly here at the intro here. So obviously I'm going to nerd out about that. But you said you're a lifelong Tolkien fan. So unsurprisingly, I usually start things off asking guests to share their Tolkien experience. So yeah, tell us about your lifelong Tolkien experience, when you first encountered him, and then, obviously how he's been continuing to impact your life.
It's difficult to describe exactly how much Tolkien has had an influence on me. Right down to the fact that when I say I knew of Tolkien's work, I knew of Middle-earth since before I can remember. I mean, my dad read me The Hobbit when I was too small to remember. One of my earliest memories is of watching the old Rankin and Bass 1977 animated film of The Hobbit. I have very distinct memories of being quite small and my younger brother and me laying in bed with my dad, and he's reading the Hobbit to us, and my younger brother asking, "Where are we?" And my father saying, "Oh, we're at the part where Bilbo and Gollum are doing riddles," and my little brother would be like, "No, where are we?" and would grab my dad's finger and have him point to where the word on the page was, because he wanted to follow along. Like, he was 2 or 3, but he understood. And when I was 10 years old, almost exactly 25 years ago, in the spring of 2001, before I realized that there was going to be a Peter Jackson film, I like to think of myself as one of the last true book firsters. And so as soon as I read it, though, I mean, I've been aware of the Lord of the Rings for a long time, and I've had been long familiar with The Hobbit. But as soon as I read the Lord of the Rings, well, I should say, as soon as I got past the Old Forest, like so many of us, where we read up to the Old Forest and we're like, I don't understand what's going on here. We pause, we come back, we pick back up. But as soon as I got through there when I was 10, it went from being a book that I love to being the book that I love. Um, I I sometimes wonder whether it hasn't had a bigger impact on me than the Bible. And I say that as someone who is a practicing Christian, who is an ordained minister, professional theologian, in terms of my development as a person and as a person of faith. In a lot of ways, Tolkien came first. That was what taught me how to uh, believe and live within the power of the story. And so from then through adolescence as an agnostic, through, like I mentioned, sort of converting to progressive Christianity as a young adult, and then through the process of theological education, working as a minister, becoming disillusioned with ministry, stepping sideways into a PhD program, from being a child myself and having the Tolkien read to me, to having my own children and reading the Lord of the Rings aloud to them when they were too small to remember. It's been one of the most consistent pieces of my life, this work and the Lord of the Rings in particular. It's incalculable, the influence that it's had on who I am today.
Oh man, thanks for sharing. I so many things about your experience resonates with mine. Where I don't Rankin and Bass film Hobbit is probably my first memory when I didn't even know that it was connected to anything related to Middle Earth or an author named Tolkien. And the Peter Jackson films were definitely sort of my gateway into the larger world of Middle Earth, and then reading them in college. And also, Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings becoming possibly, or at least arguably, more influential and present than my Christian faith in the Bible as well, and before I even knew that there was a sort of, multiple religious belonging or even concepts to even think about that sort of thing. Like it helped me where the fandoms that I had experienced in multiple places, and then navigating what it means to be a person of faith in that is just such a unique and weird experience, but also kind of fun as well. Yeah, I don't know. Is that something that you find like also exciting, or you're like, I just did a PhD on it and I need to take a break?
No, it's one of the interesting things is that I never, for a very long time, would have balked at being even called a Tolkien fan. Like that didn't seem to adequately express the way that I related to the text in the first place. I thought of fan as the kind of person who would be involved in fandom, right? Of somebody who would go and they might write fan fiction, or they might dress up at conventions or collect, you know, merchandise or memorabilia or that sort of thing. And that was until very recently never something that even really thought to cross my mind as a way to engage with the text. It was something so deeply personal to me and to the people in my life, like my father who introduced it to me, or to my childhood best friend who is a fellow Tolkien fanatic, or it was a way of, how do I put this? It was almost too personal or almost too special to be something that I wanted to go out and share with a fan community necessarily. And so fandom in that sense wasn't a place where I really started paying attention until COVID lockdown, and we all needed some kind of community to plug into. And well, I found, as one of my interviewees in my thesis project lovingly referred to it, quote unquote, gay Tolkien Twitter. And I think you and I both know what that interview means by that. And that was my first real engagement with Tolkien as a fan community, or Tolkien fandom per se, as opposed to being a Tolkien lover or Tolkien reader or somebody for whom the stories were deeply meaningful. And I think I think I would still count as a fan according to my own sort of intellectual framework of what a fan is. But I do think that that's a difference between me and a lot of people I've met who would consider themselves fans, is that the fandom was never a big part of my reason for being there or my way that I read the text until pretty recently.
I love that. The sacredness of your Tolkien existence and in the mundanity came together, you know. That's
Uh,
and so the people before we get into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff, talking about sacred and mundane and exactly what that means, in the realm of Tolkien and theology with Tolkien studies, and I guess in fandom too, there really has been this sort of small shift in focus from some of the more traditional Christian theological takes to theologies on the margins. I think I would say, still largely made up of Christian critics like ourselves, but there's an active desire and stoking of criticisms from those of other faiths and none to engage. I think we really want a sort of pluralist theological engagement of Tolkien for the both of us. But for me, you're one of like the recent big hitters in this theological shift. Do you think these theologies on the margins are needed in the current theological landscape of Tolkien studies? And if so, why?
yes. And the reason I say that is not just because I think the field of Tolkien studies is lagging behind in terms of its engagement with new theological ideas. Obviously, there have been from theological modernism and theological liberalism down for 100, 200 years now, there have been ways of engaging with theological ideas that you simply don't see in the field. Not all, but most work on Tolkien and theology up until the last few years has tended to be viewed through the lens of someone like an Augustine or an Aquinas or a Boethius, or you might get someone as recent as John Henry Newman, which makes sense since he was the founder of the Birmingham Oratory, where Tolkien grew up. But you really wouldn't see much in terms of engaging Tolkien with newer theological ideas or currents. There seemed to have been this idea that because he was a medievalist himself, then relevant theological ideas ended with the Renaissance, or maybe with the Enlightenment. And I think that's about as absurd as thinking that Tolkien's relevant intellectual and like life influences ended with the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. The man was born in 1892, lived through the First and Second World Wars, Great Depression, rise of fascism, existence of the atomic bomb, demolition of the English countryside. The man was so modern, right? His existence was so modern and so wrapped up in these critical moments of the history of Western modernity and now post-modernity. Why on earth wouldn't we want to read him in conversation with other figures who have been making sense of modernity and post-modernity in the same context? And I think that so there's definitely been a tendency to keep Tolkien's theological influences and the ways we read him locked in the past in that way. I think it's also because a lot of readings of Tolkien have themselves been pretty conservative and have wanted to end theological development at about the year 1800 and the development of Western modernity. And I think that you see this particularly right now with this kind of revanchism among not exclusively Roman Catholics by any stretch of the imagination, but you do see this very sort of reactionary turn in a lot of Christian circles and Christian nationalist circles, this idea that we have to somehow stop the advance of history and we need to return with a V to these older theological ideas and this older, quote unquote, or what we think is an older vision of quote unquote Western civilization and Western Christian values. And so, quite apart from the fact that the field has stagnated in that way for a long time, had done so up until the last 5 or 10 years, we're also existing in a context where there are some very, very powerful theological, political forces that want to keep history and ideas and religion from moving forward, and want to keep it from broadening and from the margins from speaking into the center, right? So I'm very grateful, like you say, like if I am a quote unquote heavy hitter, if I've helped in any way to open the field for Tolkien studies and more progressive, more marginal theological voices, that's great. I also am, in case it were not immediately obvious, a English speaking American white male theologian with high levels of formal education, and I would much rather see the next generation of Tolkien theologians come from totally different backgrounds, right? Like if I can help open the field, that's super, but I don't want it to end with my ideas. I think it would be best for it to get taken up by feminist theologians and liberation theologians and queer theologies and other ways of engaging the text. I see anything that I do as a beginning, not an ending.
Yeah, the beginning to the conversation rather than an ending, or at least a beginning to a type of new conversation or conversations that have existed and are now just being highlighted because, the like you said, sort of these other institutional forces trying to suppress and or at least hide that there are different fan experiences, theological articulations, weird restorationist movements, and restorationism isn't necessarily bad. It's just it tends to be dogmatic and reductionary and then exclusionary. So restorationism 9 times out of 10 is not great, and so I see that here. But I think that one of the things that I love about you and your work, and then even the group of people that we hang out with, or at least are sort of in our, I guess our little solar system of progressive intellectual Tolkien scholars and fans, is that we're trying to eliminate those barriers, to invite as many people to contribute to that conversation. I think there's a huge openness, for an example, to like fan fiction writers, where a lot of fan fiction writers have been dealing with a lot of these questions that only now Tolkien Studies has been addressing. And so to see those fan fiction writers not as just fans or internet people or just fanfic writers, but actually part of the constructive, meaning-making community of Tolkien scholarship, as well as just fandom in general. Yeah, yeah.
I absolutely agree. One of the reasons that I went to look at, there were a number of reasons why I wanted to look at non-religious readers of The Lord of the Rings, but I made a very conscious decision not to just choose. When I sent out a call for participants, I got back 1,200 people wanted to participate, and I only had space to interview 20. So that's a lot. That's a lot of people who are really interested in talking about how much they love The Lord of the Rings. And I'm very clear about this in my research. There were an awful lot of folks who were relatively white, Euro-American, and relatively, heterosexual, right? So like if you looked at the actual demographic, they definitely they skewed more in the white and the heterosexual direction. And whether that's a function of where I happen to put the calls for participants out or what have you is I think a pretty open one. I think it might largely be contextual. There may be problems with Tolkien fandom, or there may be issues with certain corners of Tolkien fandom. We can have a robust conversation about that. But in deciding who I wanted to talk to, I very deliberately said, no, I want a mix of people of different races, different gender identities, different sexual expressions, different age groups. I wanted, people ranging from a cis white male atheist in his early 20s to an African American grandmother in her 70s, from young trans and genderqueer people to biracial, asexual people, and sort of all across the spectrum. Is that in doing the research, I wanted to go find people who already would have who weighted in favor of these kinds of experiences and expressions of fandom that don't necessarily get automatically taken seriously when the assumption is that, oh, Tolkien fans are a certain kind of thing. Tolkien scholarship is a certain kind of discourse, certain kinds of experiences are and identities are normative in these ways. So even right down to who I decided to talk to was a conscious attempt on my part to bring more diverse and different and marginal voices into the conversation.
Oh man, that's awesome. It's sort of this thing that I think is both subjective and objective as well, where you're sort of queering that process, right? And even, even though you're sort of queering the sort of pool of participants, so that it reflects the queer and entangled realities of just what the world is, and even what fandoms and communities experience, right? And sort of painting these monolithic sort of broad strokes that so often become part of storytelling or even just stereotypes are actually the things that are non-normative than the actual normative queer realities that I think are actually present in fan communities. Yeah, I don't know. I guess with that, my comment in mind or not, like, so you talked about a little bit how you approach defining participants, but what about your, what sort of theological steps did you take within and without your Tolkien studies to get to your research for your PhD, as well as your methodology and all that?
Sure. So, I would say that you mean in terms of the research, like you're asking sort of where are the intellectual streams, or what are the sort of steps, like in terms of academia, or do you mean like in terms of my personal journey and how in the world did I get to this particular project?
Yes, with whatever you decide to focus on.
Sure. Um, so I'll start by answering the just a little bit of how I got to the research, because I think that will tell you why I made the kinds of decisions and look at the kinds of specific uh, issues and frameworks and methodologies I use, which is that, like I said, I grew up with The Lord of the Rings. It was this foundational and formative text for me. And for a very long time, I had been in love with it. And only as an adult, and after finding Christianity as an adult, did I want to think about. I knew that Tolkien had been a Roman Catholic, and was curious about what other Christians had to say about his work and what he might have had to say about the theological meanings. And I do attach an S to the end of meaning there on purpose, of his work. And I was distressed to find that much of the existing writing was, I found it wanting. I'll be diplomatic. I found it wanting. Much of it seemed to me to have precisely that kind of exclusivism, that kind of dogmatism to which you alluded earlier in our conversation, a sense that the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work at large was sort of a transparent glass for Christian orthodoxy. And that is not what I had found as a young person when I came to that story and it came to that world. It's not what I saw in the experience of my father, who introduced it to me. It's not what I saw in the experience of the people whom I knew and had fallen in love with the text alongside me. I didn't see people being drawn toward some cloaked vision of Christianity. I saw them responding very powerfully to a story that seemed to mean things that were not inconsistent with Christianity, but were different from it. And I wanted to know, as someone who'd come to religion as an adult and out of agnosticism. In fact, I was the president of the Secular Student Alliance at my undergraduate institution for several years, much to the chagrin of my fellow members when they realized in my senior year that I had in fact converted to Christianity. liberal Christianity, progressive Christianity, multi-faith Christianity even, but they were still a little baffled, and in fairness, so was I. So there we were. Um, but I've I'm I want to understand in a world where that's the normal, right? That religiosity, religious affiliation has been declining in this country, in the United States, and likely if you're living in a English speaking or a quote unquote Western country, the same is true for the UK, where I was living until recently, for most Western European and other countries, particularly rates of affiliation with Christianity have been declining for years and years. Fewer and fewer people are going to church, calling themselves Christians. And so what did it mean for what does it mean for a work written by somebody who is avowedly a very devout, if I think at times often very complex Catholic, to in which is a work and which can be read very fruitfully and I think completely validly through a variety of Christian theological lenses, including conservative ones. Just because I don't agree with them doesn't mean that the readings don't work or that the stuff isn't there. But what does it mean that artwork, that this world, that this work of literature can also be so deeply spiritually resonant for people who have no belief in the underlying religious commitments of the author, right? I wanted to figure out what was going on there, and is there something about the work? Is there something about readers themselves? Is there something about me that makes it so powerful to us, even though we don't share Tolkien's explicit religious beliefs? What is it that we do share with Tolkien or don't share, and how does that meaning get created in conversation with our lives, the text, and the person who created it, and the beliefs that he held? So that was the impetus for the study. In an intellectual sense, to be honest with you, the emotional impetus was reading it to my children. When the first thing they ever heard read aloud when they were born was the opening sentence of Lord of the Rings. Opening sentence of chapter 1 of the Lord of the Rings is the first words either of my children ever heard read aloud. And that was a religious experience for me. It was a religious experience to share with them this book that meant the world to me. And so I was like, okay, well, that's powerful to me. It means something to me that I wanted to share the Lord of the Rings with them before I wanted to share anything else. And if you combine my distaste for the state of the field over here, my fascination with what does spirituality look like after Christianity, or after the absolute hegemony of Christianity has begun to slip, right? At least the absolute religious and cultural hegemony of Christianity has begun to slip. And over here, given my own deeply spiritual investment in the work, which I think has something to do with my faith, but isn't identical with it. Those were the intellectual and personal and social contextual reasons that brought me to the research in the first place. And so that is a long setup to say that explains, or that informs, all of the choices I make as a scholar in the work, is this concern with what happens when this text that we love, written by this person who is very different from us, and yet in many ways very similar, or has these meaningfully similar experiences, or is able to communicate this thing that is meaningfully similar for all of us. What happens when the reader and the text meet? What happens to us and for us when we take the literature we love and make it a part of our lives, right? And so that ends up being the fundamental question that I'm interested in, is why is the Lord of the Rings meaningful? Why is it meaningful to these readers? Why is it meaningful to me? And from that, can I draw any conclusions about why it's meaningful to other readers? I hesitate to say us, right? Because who's us? But as 150 million readers and going of the Lord of the Rings can't be wrong. There's got to be something there.
Man, I'm so moved. I'm like genuinely so moved by hearing about your personal experience, and then the passion that brought to not sort of, but definitely your intellectual pursuit here, and kind of bringing those together in a way that's honest. And I think a lot of scholarship is moving in that way, where this sort of fiction, or I don't know the right word for it. Fiction feels like it's too generous a word, but just sort of this facade of the objective observer, right? Where there's no such thing. And so bringing these things, I guess you don't have to have a personal sort of passion for what you're studying, but in reality, like in so many cases, Tolkien scholars are fans and have some sort of personal experience. As in most of the time, I feel like it's as close to reading Lord of the Rings with your dad and then to your children, right? I don't think I've heard a Tolkien's fan and researcher not share some sort of personal experience like that. So I'm just very moved, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I think people will be stoked to hear that, and moved as well. But go ahead.
And I mean, what you just said is that's a huge part of my methodology. Is a practice called autoethnography, which is the idea that we can't get rid of ourselves from our research. We're always there in it. We come to the things we study, as interested parties. We have to. That's true even of the sciences, even of the quote unquote hard sciences, but especially in the humanities, especially in disciplines like the ones I'm engaged on. Maybe theology most of all, where we're talking about our fundamental beliefs and commitments about the nature of reality and human being in the world, being -in-the-world, that I can't excise myself from that. I can exercise a certain amount of critical distance, and I can exercise critical reflexivity about my own position and about the relation of my commitments to the work, but I can't get rid of myself. And more than that I shouldn't try to. That actually it's my passion and my love for the work and the deep resonance of the Lord of the Rings in my life that enables me to find in the work something which is worth exploring with others. And that one of the fundamental, methodological ideas is this concept in my work of resonance, of autoethnographic resonance. It's not, is my experience or the experience of any one of my interviewees universal? It can't be. We're just people. We're just individuals. I'm just some guy who read The Lord of the Rings when he was such and such years old, and it saved my life multiple times. And my participant, Marcel, not their real name, who's about my same age and is an ex-evangelical, genderqueer, bisexual person who left their extremely conservative evangelical upbringing after a sex abuse scandal in their church, and they couldn't live with a church where the adults they had trusted with their faith no longer, they couldn't live in that church at the same time as those adults were also telling them their friend had been abused because they were asking for it. Right? Probably should have thrown up a content warning on the beginning of that section here, and you might on the actual podcast. That there may be some discussion of these things. I put that in the thesis, but that Marcel's experience, but the Lord of the Rings is something that they carried with them from childhood into adulthood. The Lord of the Rings is a story they still share with their family and their church community. It's one of the few things that still makes sense to them as a story worth keeping from their childhood, right? Like Marcel can't do the Bible anymore for very obvious reasons, but they hold on to the Lord of the Rings because that story of people banding together to get through hard times and the world being broken but beautiful means something to them in a way that the Christianity of their childhood doesn't mean something to them anymore. That's not a universal experience, but there's something there about there's something there in my experience and in Marcel's, or in the experience of a young person who was a Mormon and grew up as a man in the Mormon church, but then deconverted and began living as a woman, and now she uses her new name that she uses for herself. She's called Rose in the study, not her real name. Rose Gamgee. It comes straight out of the Lord of the Rings. She chooses a name, literal name for herself out of this story that she still loves, and she couldn't bring it. She couldn't bring Mormonism with her. She could bring Rose Gamgee with her from being a kid, right? Or for that matter, I could list a number of them. I could go, and I'll try not to go too deeply into it in this moment, but the idea that each of these stories shouldn't be taken as representative of all other possible stories, but that in each of them we learn something about what makes the Lord of the Rings special and what makes literature special to readers. And if we listen to enough stories of how people love this work, then maybe we can learn a little bit more about what it is that makes the work so lovable, if that makes sense.
Ah, man, it totally does. And I feel like that's the shit that like makes research and like that stuff matter, where, you know, those stories that get overlooked get to be told, and not just told, but get to be sort of case studies for exploring, not, you know, or at least setting the stage for future conversations and research, but then even other people to say, that sounds a lot like my experience, right? Or at least it resonates with me deeply, where other folks are wanting, or at least they desire to have a sort of resonant experience to share. You know, one of my favorite Wesleyan theologians, her name is Mildred Bangs Winecoop, and she calls the sort of gap between theory and practice, or, you know, abstract and material, she calls it the credibility gap. And she said there's so many people in religious practice who have no idea why they're doing what they're doing, right? And not to say there's anything wrong with that, but there's something missing there. And then of course on the intellectual side, you can wax on about how metaphysically complex, you know, the world is and God is in relation to it, but ultimately, why are they doing it? And so bringing the two together, which we're always doing, and being aware of that sort of bridges that credibility gap. And the examples that you gave, and the method and the outcome of your work just reminded me of that, and seems to intentionally bridge that credibility gap in our own lives and in fandom.
Yeah, I have so much more I could say about that. In fact, I recently read a book about that subject, the thesis that is. What I'll say though is your point about, I think that I don't want to say that it is the whole purpose of literature to make possible those moments of resonance. I think literature is for lots of things. Human creative endeavor is for lots of things. But I think that something we often fail to pay adequate attention to is that is surely that's one of the great points of making art, is so that happens, right? I mean, I believe that. I believe that part of the reason that we would make art is so that someone else will have that moment of resonance. Someone else will be able to come there and be like, oh, that doesn't necessarily, I've never gone through the thing that Marcel went through, but I've been through something that's similar enough, or that feels similar to what they're describing. And so now I can connect to this person's reality that has nothing to do with mine, that would seem to have nothing to do with mine, and yet we're bridged across this common humanity, right? And maybe we don't have anything else in common, but we've both read The Lord of the Rings, and we've gotten to the Council of Elrond and cried because of the power of the world coming together to defeat evil, not by facing it down through force of arms, but by casting away power. That's something that Marcel talks about explicitly in their interview, is how they read the chapter of the Council of Elrond during COVID and began to cry during part of it for that reason. And so maybe I don't have anything else in common with this person, except that I understand when I read the Council of Elrond. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense to me. Or I've read this other part of the Lord of the Rings. For me, for instance, often when Sam and Frodo are in Cirith Ungol and they're talking about stories and what will happen someday when people tell stories about us. I mean, I cry on every other page of the Lord of the Rings. Let me be very, very clear. I actually can't get through the thing without just weeping constantly. Um, 19 times as
Naturally,
of this year, and I
naturally.
still cannot get through this thing without every time I'm brought up short by something new. Um, and by every time, I mean every time I sit down with it. Every time I sit down with it, I'm brought up short by some new flash of insight. Um, but that my hope is that not deliberately in the work, the idea was trying to bring these different people's experiences together of what literature means to them. And that to me is going to tell us as much or more about what the spiritual religious meaning of the Lord of the Rings is than anything to do with the metaphysics of the Valar. Sorry. I think that's interesting. I think metaphysics of the Valar is interesting. I could write and probably will write articles on it at some point in future, but show me how the Lord of the Rings carried somebody through the death of a grandparent, and I will show you the spiritual significance of the Lord of the Rings.
Hell yeah, dude. Hell yeah. Um, and are you really? Well, I won't question other people's, experiences, but I mean, if you're not crying while you're reading The Lord of the Rings, are you even reading it right? That's as close to dogmatism as I'll get. But at the time of this interview right now, your dissertation isn't available on Glasgow's website yet. But your Mythlore article, An Aspirational Cultist, Tolkien Fandom at the Borders of Belief, is currently available online, and I'll link that in the show notes. I think it's a good introduction into what you've done in your doctoral research. But there's 3 terms that you explain and explore in the article. 1, sacred world building. 2, secondary faith community. And 3, fan liturgy. Could you give us sort of a summarized rundown of each term and how they come together to build upon each other in your work?
Sure. So, sacred world building. One of the things when you sit down, you're going to decide you're going to think about what does it mean to have spiritual? How does a non-explicitly religious text like The Lord of the Rings do religious work, or how does it have spiritual meaning for non-religious people? Or you want to start answering that constellation of questions, right? Well, one of the things you realize very quickly is you've got to figure out what the hell you mean by religion. It is a word we all use and is in fact way more complicated, far more complicated than it initially seems on the surface. Because if you think that religion means a system of beliefs and doctrines and worship practices, my friend, you're just thinking about the version of Christianity you're most familiar with, and that is not what religion is. Religion is a lot of different things and could mean a lot of different things depending on the historical era in which you find yourself, and whether the word religion itself is even a particularly good descriptor of non-Christian faith traditions is an open question, let alone whether it's even it's a useful analytical term at all, or whether we should jettison it in favor of something like spirituality or cults or who's to say, right? So you've got yourself a question of definition that needs answering. And in the Mythlore article that you're referencing, I define religion as sacred world building. Now, I'm going to tell you, Nick, my thesis revises that a little bit. I published the article. I published the article and found that I couldn't hold. Well, let's see if I can do a good job of summarizing really briefly how I would end up using the term sacred world building. So the idea that this is good. Now you got me actually trying to think through the way that I actively revised it in the thesis on the fly. You know what? I'm going to say you can read the article if you want a sense of what I meant by sacred world building as the fundamental building block of what religion is. I'm going to tell you what I actually now think, which is that religion is enchanted world building. And by enchantment, I use the philosopher Charles Taylor's idea of the transition from enchanted pre-modernity into disenchanted modernity. So Charles Taylor is a Roman Catholic theologian, philosopher, and talks about how we got from a world in which it is possible, in which everybody basically believed in God, in which not believing in God or not being religious was basically unthinkable, right? Except for maybe a few edge cases, to a world in which any kind of religious belief at all is one option among many. What is the process that gets us from a world where God or gods are a given for 99.9% of humans, at least as far as we can tell, right? Based on the historical record and anthropological record. I'm not going to make any strong generalizations, but that appears to have been the case, to our modern world, in which many people still are religious, obviously, but not everyone is. And the idea of the existence of a god or gods, of a world of spirits and unseen intelligences, is one you could believe in or not believe in, right? And so for Taylor, my shortened version of this is what it means to live in an enchanted world is you are a subject who moves through the world, who is constituted by your relationships to other things, to other beings. You live in a world with other kinds of persons and intelligences. You are not in and out. You're not in a subject in yourself and of yourself and for yourself. You're porous. You're open to influences from outside. You're constituted by a web of relationships that includes everything from the interpersonal to the local to the social to the political to the cosmic to the ecological. And maybe most importantly, you move through a world that's meaningful. The world you inhabit is not simply one in which there is a series of chance encounters. There are no chance encounters on the roads of Middle Earth, right? You're moving through a world that is soaked with meaning. That meaning isn't something you just have to create entirely for yourself, sort of existentialist style, but is one that how would I put this? That there's meaning out there to be found. Now, that doesn't mean there's only one meaning out there to be found, or that everything is teleological. It just means that meaning isn't something you completely have to generate for yourself. And for a lot of us in the West, that historically sense of meaningfulness was experienced as a sense of narrativity, like our lives are part of a great tale, to use a very Tolkienian phrase, right? So this is Taylor's sense of an enchanted world. It is a flexible sense of an enchanted world that seems to resonate with a way we think about religious worlds in a number of other world religious traditions, ranging from indigenous ontologies in the United States to historical forms of Christianity in pre-modern times and in modern times. We can use it as a framework for understanding New Age and New Thought spiritualities, and for understanding Hinduism and Buddhism, right? So there's some. I'm not going to make a claim that enchanted world building is the end all be all of ways to understand religion, but it's the one that I choose for the purposes of my research, because you have to define terms somehow. And because to me, the question of sacredness eventually ended up becoming untenable, because I think the idea of there being sacred secular or sacred and profane is something that is very much a Christian binary. I don't think that other traditions necessarily have that same sense of there's the holy and there is the unholy. I don't even think that historical Christianity has the same kind of strong binary that we think about, of like, oh, there's God who is completely different from us, and then there's material reality, which is totally different from God. And there is pure and there's impure, right? I think actually it's much more complicated than that within Christianity itself and Christian history. And I also just don't think that kind of binary applies to a lot of other religious traditions. I think things are a lot clearer than that. I think the boundaries are a lot more slippery and fluid and porous, if you will, than that. I'm afraid that's not going to be the world's most concise answer to how to understand that first concept of sacred or enchanted world building. But suffice it to say that for my purposes, religion is an enchanted world. It's a meaningful world. It's one in which there's a sense of deep connection to a self who is not simply a monad, is not simply the buffered Cartesian self, but is part of this interlocking web of relationship, and who moves through a world that has a sense of meaning and wonder, which inheres in things and in persons, and in which the world is not merely an object to be interacted with and measured and exploited, but is in some sense a person to be encountered and to be, if not loved, then at least respected.
Yeah, I think that even though it's not as clear, I feel like most of the people that listen to this will be stoked, because some people run into the, not clear, concise, whatever you want to call it, definition. Maybe, and some people will get, discouraged by that. But I think people like us and even people who are kind of in sort of the atmosphere of listeners that I have will be like, oh, more questions, entanglement, porousness. Let's freaking go, dude. Right. Like I love that. So I guess with you changing it to like enchantment rather than kind of, or I guess moving away from the sacred profane binary, like how did that affect your understanding of the secondary faith community, or did it?
So I think fundamentally that this so when I talk here, so let me be really clear. So one of the reasons that I use this definition of world building, of the idea of a religious world, of religion is an enchanted world. A religious world is when you live in one in which things are connected by this sense of wonder and relationship, and the self is part of this interlocking web of meaningful connections and relationships, right? This is also when Tolkien wants to talk about what is a fantasy world, what is a secondary world, he calls it, he talks about what is fantasy itself, right? What is faerie on fairy stories? He says it's enchantment. The best word he can find to describe that elvish craft by which a storyteller calls a fantasy secondary world into being is enchantment. That the world of a story, set in a fantasy world, is one in which there is this same sense of interrelatedness. And most importantly, I think, of the secondary world of a fantasy novel or of a fantasy story of any kind is this question of meaningfulness, not because the world is like necessarily like Middle Earth, where there is a sense that it's part of a great providential unfolding of the music of Iluvatar, right? Like Middle Earth is one where it's like, oh, there actually is sort of a meaningfulness literally built into the structure of reality, which is the music with a capital M. I mean that when you are reading a story, somebody put it there, right? The story is not there on accident. The Lord of the Rings exists because J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it, right? And he wrote it so that when you read it, you're going to go from the opening words that I read to Ari and Ellie, my children, when they were first born, of, when Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced he would be celebrating his 11st birthday, there was much ado in Hobbiton, or however exactly it goes, right? And you were going to get to Sam Gamgee coming back up the hill from leaving Frodo at the Grey Havens and coming back and to Rosie and Eleanor and sitting down and saying, well, I'm back, right? Like that is what you're going to get. You will get taken on a journey from here to there. There is a story which structures your experience of the world. And so as you move through it, it is necessarily, the enchanted world of a fantasy novel is necessarily meaningful, even if the world, the secondary world of the back of it is purely nihilistic, right? Even if there is deliberately no God and there's no particular like sense of history going anywhere, the story itself is going somewhere. the story that is of the Lord of the Rings, as opposed to the story of Middle Earth or whatever the relevant cosmology might be in that case. And so when you're inside of a fantasy story, when you're inside of a fantasy novel, when you're inside of a fantasy world in that way, you are already inside of a meaningful world, right? You're the reader, I argue, is having an experience of something like religion simply by being pulled into the world of the text. The difference with this, of course, is that when you and I read The Lord of the Rings, my working assumption is that we don't believe that Middle Earth exists or ever did actually exist in a primary way, right? Now, there are people, Tolkien spiritualists, who believe at least in some level of the ontological reality of a figure like Gandalf or the elves or the Valar. And I don't know what the nature of their religious experience is or the way in which they're, building that into their belief structure. I don't know what the credibility gap is there necessarily. I don't share those beliefs, but that's one could conceivably build any fantasy novel if they wanted to, or if they had the right kind of belief system into their primary world religious beliefs. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that when you and I and most people, I think, come to The Lord of the Rings, we recognize that it's fiction. And we know that when we finish it, when we finish the book, then my copy of The Lord of the Rings right next to me, my battered child has pulled the covers off omnibus copy of The Lord of the Rings, which I keep because that's the one with the consistent pagination with a PDF copy on my computer, so I can word search it. When we close it, the story ends. Middle Earth, quote unquote, goes away, right? And that is different than if you read the Bible and you believe when you close the pages of the Bible that the world of the Bible still somehow persists beyond its pages. Right? Now, I want to be very clear about something. Do I think that the actual events like of, for instance, the Gospel according to John happened in the way that they are described in the Gospel according to John? I regret to inform some of my listeners, no, I do not think that there are literal recounting of historically verifiable things that occurred. Do I believe in a world where resurrection is the foundation, it's like the fundament of reality? Boy, we can have a conversation about what the hell that means, but yes, I do. For me, the enchanted world that the Bible and the Christian tradition, as I understand it, creates for me persists beyond the pages of the Bible itself or any one story that I read within it. Right? My commitment is that that's actually in some way a true rendering of the nature of reality. Now, I want to also be clear about something. I also think that the underlying ontology of the Lord of the Rings is in some ways a true rendering of the nature of reality, but in a different way. What I should say here, though, is that there's no expectation on the part of the reader that when you walk away, you're going to believe in anything that happened in Lord of the Rings actually happened in history. There's no belief that you're going to walk away from it and then there's going to be a church that you're going to go to on Sunday morning where other people are going to believe it with you. There's not. When we come to it, we understand that it's fiction. We understand that it's secondary. But if the dynamics of religion, if we're immersed in an enchanted religious world, or if we're immersed in an enchanted world, when we're both reading The Lord of the Rings and when we're participating in Christianity, I'm going to use myself as an example here, then that means something meaningfully similar is happening when I'm inside both of those worlds. But what does it mean if it's happening inside a world that I know, quote unquote, doesn't exist? What changes if I consciously am aware, or by the very nature of the text itself, tells me that this is not real? That this is a reality which will fade, must necessarily fade when you close the pages of the book? That to me is a very interesting question. So when I talk about secondary faith, I'm talking about what is the kind of, or secondary religiosity is the way that I talk about it in my research, is what is the nature of a religious experience? What is the nature of religious meaning that is produced by what is the nature of the experience and the meaning that takes place, maybe not produced, but takes place when I am enchanted by a fantasy novel? And how does that spill over into my life? Right? Because if I'm enchanted by the world of Christianity, well, then I'm a Christian. And presumably that means then that I have some like, it calls forth certain kinds of responsibilities from me. Maybe I'm supposed to love my neighbor. And what does that look like in practice? Well, my faith community is going to help me figure out what that looks like in practice, or my personal prayer life is going to help me figure out what that looks like in practice. Okay, well, what is the nature of the experience and the meaning that takes place when I'm immersed in the Lord of the Rings, and how does it spill over into my life? Those are the kinds of that's the question that I'm looking at. Like, what does it mean for something to be secondarily religious, where I know that it's not real and I don't expect it to have this commanding influence over my life, and yet it still must have some kind of influence, because as I mentioned to you at the top of this episode, it's maybe the single most influential text that I've ever read, even if it's not the one that I claim as the foundation of my religious tradition. Is this making any sense at all? Because I fear that your listeners are going to be thrown for a loop as I'm trying to work this out with you here.
No, it makes total sense, and I think that people will love just going through this, because just hearing about Charles Taylor, which I feel like a lot of listeners will know, and like exploring that through a Tolkienian lens, and then also talking about using even some of Tolkien's own understanding of a secondary world to, help frame your development of this secondary faith community, I think is just so fascinating, and something that I think is, and obviously I didn't do the research like you did, but it feels like, and what it sounds like, is that it's at least in part true in articulating the way that not just Tolkien fans or experience those sort of things, but I think it could probably apply to a lot of people in a lot of different fandoms, not even just nerdy ones, like music fandoms, movie goers, that sort of thing. And it gets me pumped. And I guess too, from there, like if that's the place where people are sort of creating this secondary faith community within their fandoms, having these sort of pseudo religious experiences, like what did those look like in the fan liturgies? And I guess too, I'm going to combine both of my questions here, if it's not too much, but did those things that you discovered in fan liturgies within your research, did they match sort of your hypotheses as well?
Sure. So for your listeners, the concept of the fan liturgy was, in the Mythlore article, was okay. So let's sort of use this idea of, let's take the idea of secondary religiosity. Well, what happens if you get a community of people who are invested in the same enchanted world, but or in the same secondary world, and do some of the things that resemble the things which religions do, but aren't, for instance, like the Tolkien Society is the one that I use in the article as I look at their annual ritual of Inyalie, which is a ritual of remembrance that takes place at J.R.R. Tolkien's grave in Oxford every September as part of the annual meeting of the UK Tolkien Society. And if you end up looking at it, it is not designed to be a worship service. It's not, nobody sat down and was like, all right, and here's where we need to put like the sending hymn, and here's where we need to put like the scripture reading. But it ends up organically taking the form of, or at least taking a form very similar to a Christian worship service, in the way that it involves people gathering together in a churchyard around Tolkien's grave. There are readings, there are moments of silence, there is singing from the Nemariae, the Tolkien's own setting of the Nemariae, of Galadriel's farewell song in Lorien. And the effect of all of this is quite powerful. It's, I've been told by former chairs of the Tolkien Society that often in the Inyalie at Oxenmoot, the annual gathering, is people understand that the purpose of it is to have a good cry, right? That the understanding is that we're here specifically to like move some energy through, to let people have this emotional release after what can be a very intense weekend of seeing people and learning about Tolkien and engaging in all sorts of fanish activities and drinking and carousing and conversations late into the wee hours of the morning. And this is a space where people can give thanks to Tolkien himself, of course, for the work that he created and that it's brought us all together, and also to, almost to sacralize. We'll bring some of that language back, like the relationships that have been created and maintained by this experience of going to Oxford, of going and meeting people and renewing, like beginning friendships or renewing old friendships or what have you, right? So there it has, from the perspective of somebody who's led hundreds and hundreds of Christian worship services, I immediately went to that and said, oh, this worship is happening here. We're not worshiping Tolkien, but like worship is this is a worship service, and I'm going to figure out what the hell that means. In a similarly to the way that I read aloud The Lord of the Rings to my kids, I was like, oh, I'm having a religious experience. I'm going to figure out what the hell that is. My basic take on Tolkien and theological studies is a very fundamentally self-interested one. Of I have an experience, and I'm like, oh, that was religious. I want to understand what specifically about Tolkien made that happen and why it's different from Christianity, because I'm pretty sure that thing that I just experienced is not Christian. It's all a form of eisegesis, I'm afraid. It's all just me exegeting myself. But all that is as much to say, so that's what I meant by fan liturgy and secondary faith community, of this idea that you could have communities that come together around these secondary religious worlds of fantasy fiction, or of, for that matter, I think you're right that there's applicability as well with non-narrative media, right? I'm also a Beatles fan. I've been a part of Beatles fan message boards for also a quarter of a century, and there's believe me when I tell you that that's also has a quasi-religious element to it. The way I get about the Beatles is another thing that I share very. We're not going to get into the Beatles and my relationship to the band and the way I share them with my kids, because that's we don't need to go down that particular rabbit hole. But it's another place where I could sit down and easily, I could have done a PhD on the Beatles and religion. Let's put it that way. I've decided that I will take the most obvious and best-selling examples of a thing, like rock music or fantasy literature, and then explain to you why it's actually really cool and it's perfectly fine that it is the best-selling and most famous example of it. But so this question then of what did I find that was different in my research in terms of looking at what I anticipated for people's maybe religious or secondarily religious response to The Lord of the Rings? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess too, like in that, like what, you kind of gave some examples of just the story of some of your participants, but I guess too, maybe bring in sort of like also what surprised you as well. If there were there had to be some surprising things, right?
I think when I set out to do the study, I had an intuition that something religious was happening, even for people who aren't. Like, I had an intuition that The Lord of the Rings was doing some kind of spiritual work, or what I would define as spiritual or religious work, right? For people, even those who don't necessarily have a commitment to a religion in the primary world, right? Like, I knew from experience and had observed, and it also seen in fan communities and the way that arguments over the meaning of the text and the meanings of the text took place, as we might have alluded to earlier, for instance, the battles over what's an acceptable form of fan fiction, or can you have a black elf or black dwarves, right? What is diverse casting somehow non-canon? What does it mean to have a canon for The Lord of the Rings? And is canon compliance something that's significant or not, right? Like when I started doing my PhD, it was just around the time that Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power began airing. And so there were a lot of these kinds of arguments about canon and about whether whether Tolkien was woke or not, or whether Tolkien was actually would have supported whether progressives and queer people were, whether Tolkien would have hated them, right? Like, oh, Tolkien would have hated you effing queers, right? And it's like, I mean, maybe it probably would have hated J.D. Vance too. So like, I don't know that the opinions of a man who's been dead for more than 50 years and was born prior to the First World War is necessarily like what I should set my own personal values by, right? But I can tell you that the man would not have particularly cared for a surveillance company called Palantir. So like, let's try to at least tier out what Tolkien would have hated. If we're going to decide that we care what Tolkien would have hated, let's try to figure out what he would have hated more on balance. But the point being that my observation in both in fan communities and then in the scholarship of it was clearly doing religious work, even if not explicitly religious, or it was doing something that I would call religious, or it had religioid features, right? Like sort of religion-esque features. And I think when I went in, I was under the impression that there was going to be a fairly like one-to-one, like, oh, well, a person doesn't have religion, but now they do have the Lord of the Rings, and that provides some of the same kinds of meanings for them, right? Or they don't have religion anymore, but it's a place where some of those same religious sentiments or religious experiences can still happen for them. And I don't want to say that that's not true in some cases, but I think what surprised me most, and in a good way, was just how diverse the experiences of the people I talked to were. The like particularly granular ways that their individual stories intersected with the Lord of the Rings, and how some people had this powerful relationship to the text. And then other people would have relatively similar biographical details and then have a totally different experience of the text. I had two readers, for instance, who both grew up during the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, and both loved the Lord of the Rings and came to the Lord of the Rings during that period. And for one of them, they grew up in a home that had been extremely sort of physicalist, atheist, very achievement oriented, very religion was not something that was practiced and was not something that was held up as a valuable part of life. And so the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's works became a space for them as a young person where they could explore some of those questions of meaning and values and who am I and who do I want to be in the world, in a way that their very utilitarian upbringing and very didn't make space for, right? And then another person in more or less at a very similar, I'm not going to say the same, but like who had some of the similar context. For them, they had grown up in a household that was still very covertly religious under communist rule. And so when they read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, it was going to a very strict Lutheran boarding school, which had just reopened after the fall of communism. And for them, they experienced The Lord of the Rings as a refuge from religious dogmatism. So, like you might say, oh, well, somebody reading it in the context of the fall of the Soviet Union, oh, I could see where like, oh, it's a sort of religious text, but not a religious, what I mean? Like you might look at those two experiences and make an assumption based on historical context that in the lived experience of the particular reader in question just turns out to be, it's much more tricky and complex than that. And number two, the way that it would become a refuge of irreligion for somebody raised in a religious household, and would become a refuge for spirituality for somebody, would become a place to rebel against religion for somebody raised in a religious household, and then would become a refuge for questions of spirituality and morality for someone raised in an irreligious household. You see what I'm saying? Like that's such an interesting crunchiness to individual experience. Like I love how like I wouldn't have expected that kind of specificity. And what I mean by that is those are experiences that I wouldn't have like conjured out of thin air. Now that I hear them, it's like, oh, that makes total sense to me, right? But like I would every person's experience surprised me that way. It turns out that when you actually get down to what people's lives are like and you let them tell you about their experience of, I mean, I don't want to say their experience of Lord of the Rings, because what was remarkable was how much of themselves and their lives people would share with me. It turned out that the Lord of the Rings would show up for people at these often these like really critical moments. Either they'd first read it for the first time during a period of personal crisis or personal growth, or it would come back around at an important moment later in their life. And so you'd find out. I heard from multiple people who read it to their kids, aloud to their kids. I heard from other parents who had done the same thing I had done. And I'd heard from people who'd had it read to them aloud when they were little, just like happened with me. So you'd end up getting these little glimpses into really intimate moments of people's lives and really intimate moments of their development as people. That like that to me was almost the at least at an individual personal level, that was maybe the coolest thing about it, was just to suddenly see, oh my God, this story does mean something to people, and you get this window into the lives of other people just by asking them, why do you love the Lord of the Rings? What does it mean to you? Why do you keep coming back to it?
I love that example of the two participants who grew up when the former Soviet Union dissolved. And like you said, that weird sort of opposite directions of the Lord of the Rings being sort of this canopy of pseudo religiosity, and then the place where like they go to escape religion is so fascinating. That is so that is just like you said, to experience that firsthand and then to be surprised by that, it just sounds really cool. Really, really cool.
It I that meeting point between the book itself and then between people's lived experience of it and then mine, I part of having to, when I set out to do the study, I had no intention of taking this autoethnographic, sort of critically reflecting on my own experience approach to it. But as I realized how entangled I was with the story, I realized that I needed to work. Like I needed to go and I needed to like look and I needed to look within, right? I needed to really reflect on my own relationship to the story and my own relationship to its meanings, so that I wouldn't just project all over my participants, right? I needed to be critically reflexive about my own positionality and my own relationship to the work. And it was through that process that I reread The Lord of the Rings, which I did not anticipate doing. I did an incredibly detailed reread of The Lord of the Rings, according to a liturgical calendar from December 25th of 2023 to March 25th of 2024, which is what I would do as a kid. Departure of the Fellowship from Rivendell on the one hand, on the 25th of December, to the destruction of the ring on the 25th of March on the other hand. And basically every day I would read a chapter, or every other day, or maybe every few days I would read a couple chapters and take incredibly detailed notes, not just on the text itself, but on what do I remember about where I was the first time I read this, or the second time I read this, or the fifth time I read this. I cried so hard over Lothlorien. Why am I like? What is going on inside me that I am having this emotional response? And I think that in exploring my own emotional, spiritual relationship to the text, and then being able to read that alongside the emotional, spiritual relationship of other people to the text, and then being able to sit with the text of the Lord of the Rings. So having these long interviews with people and my own field notes on myself and the Lord of the Rings sort of sitting in a triangle, like looking at each other, like able to understand my own life in new ways and able to then understand the lives of my participants in new ways, which helped me to understand the Lord of the Rings in new ways. That was the thing, I think, that dialogue or even that trialogue, which produced this. For me, I feel like I understand the Lord of the Rings so much more deeply as a novel, and of what makes it so special because I talk to people about what it means to them. By looking at why it's meaningful to us as readers and why it's meaningful to others and letting that be a conversation, we actually learn about the text. It's not just that we're learning about how people read it. We're learning about the it which is being read. We're learning, like, the book is coming into being through the act of being read. And so as the book that I read now is by no stretch of the imagination the same one that I read when I set out on this PhD. I literally, I reread it recently this last year in preparation to do my PhD defense, my Viva, and I found myself thinking specifically of my participants and the stories they'd told me. I found myself, there was a place in particular where one of my participants had grown up. She is an anthropologist, and she had grown up as a non-Mormon in Utah. So again, sort of the contrasts there. We had the young Mormon woman who grew up being raised as a man in the Mormon church. And then we had a young woman who was raised as an Episcopalian, but as an adoptee. So she was adopted when she was a tiny child, and raised non-Mormon in Utah, and felt deeply, deeply isolated and alienated as a child as a consequence of being an adopted child and growing up in a completely religiously other environment where she was not part of the in-group, right? And then she discovered The Lord of the Rings when she was 18 years old. Her husband, the person who would become her husband, and she got it from the person who would become their mutual best friend. They all read it together when they became 18, and then they read it dozens of times after that. They got matching tattoos of Eldoreth Gilthoniel, and they would go on hiking trips in the Utah desert and take their paperback, like their busted paperback copies of The Lord of the Rings with the Barbara Remington bonkers cover art on it, and they would go and read it to each other under the stars by campfire light. And I had this very, very intense experience whilst rereading Aragorn singing the lay of Beren and Luthien to the hobbits under Weathertop. I found that Melody, not her real name, her talk of being lonely, but then finding The Lord of the Rings, and then finding other people who loved it and being able to feel less alone under the stars and reading it and telling these stories to one another. And then that almost got overlaid, it double exposed some of the language I use in the article. It got double exposed over my reading experience. And I'll never go back to that piece of the text the same way again, right? Like when I read The Lord of the Rings, Melody will always be there with me, reminding me that we are not alone, and that when we tell these stories to one another, we are not alone. And that changes me. That changes a person. Like that, the text does not mean the same thing. It's not the same story anymore. That, to me, again, you want to tell me what the meaning, the spiritual meaning of The Lord of the Rings is. I find the theology of the stars, of Varda, the Star Kindler, like that's all very interesting to me, and I think you can do really interesting theological work with that. Show me Melody reading it under the. That's what the theological meaning of The Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry. That's why this fucking matters. I'm gonna use my one F-bomb for my theological podcast right there.
That's your one F for the PG-13 episode.
You can bleep that out if you need to, or cut that in the edit. But and I suppose I have many more things I could say about it, but that moments like that are the reason that the thesis ended up being not just something that I found deeply fascinating, but also deeply personally meaningful, as it connected me to other people. It connected me to a deeper sense of who I am and who I've become as a consequence of being in relationship with this story. The thesis itself was a kind of going on a journey. It was a kind of storytelling project in and of itself. That went a little bit further afield from your question, but if you're going to ask what surprised you, what I just described is what most surprised me.
No, and it was wonderful, and your kind of shift to autoethnography, or at least deciding to incorporate that sort of approach, makes sense. obviously in retrospect it's a little easier to see that because you're literally talking about how that participant is literally their shared experiences impacting the way that you experience reading the text itself. And almost like there's a communion of saints after those who have passed on, right? But there's almost like this communion of readers, both living and past, right? um I just, where you can't do anything but be impacted by others who share those experiences, or at least those you encounter, and whether or not it's consciously or subconsciously.
And that was, I think, one of the things that if you read the Mythlore article, I say that I think community formation is one of the most like the key factors in secondary religiosity, right? If secondary religiosity is like, oh, you form communities around these texts that are particularly meaningful. And in the thesis, I very specifically revise that. I say, no, you make relationships. They help you make and maintain relationships, because I'm not necessarily making any kind of formal community with Melody or with Marcel or with these other individuals that I've read it with, but I'm now in relationship with them, right? Even if it's the relationship of a researcher to participant. um, but you see, I saw this constantly in the stories of the folks I interviewed, but also have experienced this with others, is that the Lord of the Rings connects me to my dad. It connects me to my kids in the same way that you see that with a lot of my participants. It would connect them with their parents or their friends or their partners. A young woman, well, I say young, she's about my age, and I regret to inform myself that I'm speeding toward middle age at this point. So, but a fellow millennial is what I should say, almost exactly my age, who had found it very difficult to make friends as a child, because of like awkward this like real like social anxiety when they found two friends who were as into the Lord of the Rings as they were as a teenager. That became their like their core unit, were these three kids who then learned how to be like less socially anxious and socially awkward and have each other as like, and the Lord of the Rings is like the glue that welded this little nerdy trio together. And that being those are still deeply important relationships to this person, right? And got them through the awkwardness of being a queer adolescent, a queer Jewish. Well, she doesn't like the term secular Jewish because she feels that secular implies a certain level of implicit Christianity. And you know what? I think she has a point, but she's a non-religious Jew, is what I should say, cultural, ethnic, etc. Jewish person, and Dana, not her real name. But Dana talking about the significance of the book as this thing that allowed her to have relationship at a time in her life when she was not able otherwise to have relationships. That had a lot of trouble with bullying and inability to connect with other kids her age, and then that, or even just the Lord of the Rings acting. I had another participant, Neil, who, not his real name, who would talk about he and his university friends would just sit around at night talking about the gross Shire product and how a economy as fundamentally rural as the Shires could support the particular level of population density that it had, right? And so even that, like, it's just him and his mates at university, but it becomes a common language, right? Like the Lord of the Rings becomes this kind of like symbolic code to talk about these other things, which aren't like, oh, well, we can talk about questions of like economics or questions of politics or questions of like morality, that maybe aren't like, we're not necessarily, these aren't necessarily my best friends in the world. They're not necessarily creating the most like lasting relationships, but by being this common shared reference point, the Lord of the Rings allows me to develop these kinds of relationships where we can bounce these ideas around, right? It's what the literary theorist Michael Saylor calls public spheres of the imagination. This place where you can go and you can use fiction and you can use these sort of imaginative story worlds as a way to engage like conversation with others about things that aren't just the story world, right? The way that Lord of the Rings or Tolkien becomes a way for you and me and lots of other people to talk about theology or to talk about politics or to talk about problems of queerphobia and white supremacism, right? Like it becomes this narrative symbolic framework for all these other kinds of conversations. I'd revised back from community building, which I do think takes place in the context of shared love for a story like The Lord of the Rings. We see that in fandom, obviously, but I think as important are these kind of more granular and individualized relationships. They're not necessarily going to like some of the one like Marcel, go back to Marcel that I interviewed, has traveled around the world to go see people they met in online fandom, right? So it's not like fandom relationships aren't important. It's just that my observation is that what really makes it stick for at least the people I've talked to, and in my anecdotal observation, seems to be when it links us to other people like in a more meaningful and individual or small groupish way, rather than just being, oh, I'm part of this nebulous thing called fandom. You know, it's about what are the human relationships that it makes possible and gives us this common reference point to articulate.
Oh man, and I'm going to have our sort of last question here come down on this personal and granular sort of tone. But I guess, to get real personal, Tom, for those of us who have undergone like a sort of pseudo religious experience pertaining to Tolkien and his work, and I guess others too, maybe around us with others or just ourselves, but like what might that mean for us? And for those of us who belong to a faith belief system or community, as well as those that don't belong or aren't, engaged in those sort of faith understandings and practices and communities, like what does healthily navigating that complexity, that entanglement look like in your view?
Great question. Where I come down in my research right now, where I've come down as a result of the process of the PhD, is that I think what The Lord of the Rings fundamentally has helped me to do, and my observation of what it has fundamentally helped my participants to do, and I believe based on my reading of what I've heard from others, as well as my reading of Tolkien scholarship and Tolkien criticism writ large, is that I think fundamentally The Lord of the Rings is about the ability to let go. It's about many things, but the past, having to recede into the past, and that being inescapable, and that being sad, and that being unavoidable, and the text, both in terms of its content, in terms of its story, where you find Middle Earth literally in the process of disenchanting itself. Go back to this idea that I had earlier of the world of the text enchants you as long as you are there, but then when you pull away from it, you are disenchanted. You are no longer inside the secondary world of the text. You are you go back to the world, as it were, outside, as Tolkien writes in On Fairy Stories. And for a lot of my readers, their experience of religion is like that, is they were inside the enchanted world of Mormonism or of evangelicalism, and or of their childhood Lutheranism in the former Soviet bloc. And then once they deconverted, now they look at that religion as if it were a little abortive secondary world. Right? They're looking at it from the perspective of somebody who can look and say, oh, that's a fantasy over there that I was once inside of and that once enchanted me, but no longer is meaningful. Immersion broke, right? I no longer believe in the system. I'm no longer fully involved in that system. And my experience and the experience of my participants is that happens for us all the time. We're constantly in these little, how do I put this? I think life involves a series of little disenchantments, whether those are the sort of story worlds of the faith traditions or the meaning-making structures we use to help us move through the world, or whether those are the stories of who we are or who we were supposed to be, maybe the enchanted narrative world of a marriage, or the enchanted narrative world of the myth of progress, of the idea of a country that is on its way toward greater justice and equality and truth, or the whatever the case may be, The Lord of the Rings is about the end of an enchanted world, both at the level of content and at the level of what it actually is, which is a fantasy. So when you get to the end of it and there's this incredible sadness at the loss of a world where there are elves and wizards, and even if Aragorn comes back to the throne, even if the Shire is saved, we know, the reader knows, that whatever this world is, it must fade out of existence eventually, because we live in the world we live in. And if this is quote unquote the fictive proto prehistory of our world, as my thesis advisor Dimitri Fimi once wrote of it, then we know that Gondor and Arnor don't exist anymore, right? And I think what The Lord of the Rings does is it says, yes, your world will be disenchanted, and that will be very difficult. That does not mean that life is not worth living, however, right? The Lord of the Rings is not it's sad, but it's not desolate at the end. It's hopeful, but it's not optimistic. This is very Verlin Flieger, right? Like, this is if you've never read her essay, The Arch and the Keystone, I had the cause to reread it recently. It's the first essay in her book, A Real Taste for Fairy Stories, which I'm reviewing for a journal. And it's such a bloody good essay. If you have it, if your listeners presumably have read it, but if they haven't, for God's sake, run out, get a copy of Verlin Flieger's The Arch and the Keystone. It's free, it's open access on Mythlore from 2019. Just read the damn thing. Because she points out that there's Tolkien never lets a happy ending go unsaddened, and he never lets nothing is ever fully hopeless, but nothing is ever fully hopeful either. And I think The Lord of the Rings is a beautiful story about how to live a meaningful life in the midst of disenchantment, and about how to live in a world where Middle Earth must lose the elves and Lothlorien and wonder and magic as a condition of defeating Sauron, right? You cannot actually get to the Fourth Age without losing the power of the three Elven rings. That's something I only realized rereading The Lord of the Rings in conversation with my participants, and looking at the way that it had shown up in our lives to help bridge over these meaning gaps and these moments of disenchantment in our own lives, and help us to see that as irreparable, perhaps. Not irreparable. We can't retrieve the past, but we can live well in the future, right? The future is not devoid of meaning simply because we have lost something precious. And in fact, it is okay to grieve for the loss of something, the past, as something beautiful. I think this is something we're not necessarily very good at as radicals and progressives, as seeing the past as something that is, in fact, mostly to be celebrated for being paved over. And look, I'm not saying that there are many things about the past that I'm not particularly attached to, but I also think that we are not very good often at grieving, or allowing grief for what has passed, and also recognizing that there are things that we may have lost that may be really important. We live in a world in which, we're losing very important things, like we're losing our own English countryside that Tolkien lost when he was a child, right? We're losing incredible natural beauty. We're losing institutions that, however imperfect, helped millions of people lead better lives. We are seeing the daily erosion of the rights of our fellow citizens in this country. We're living quite apart from the individual experiences of loss and grief. We're living in a period of incredible, or I think of just profound generational, possibly, I think, world historic loss of something that was deeply, deeply important and precious and irreplaceable. And so a story like The Lord of the Rings, for me, helps me to live honestly and hopefully in the midst of that. And that, I think, is a power that it has potentially for a reader, regardless of whether they happen to share my faith or not. I mean, I concretely observe that my participants didn't have to be Christians to get that out of it. And that is something that I don't know that even Christianity is always particularly good at, is grieving the past. I think a religious tradition that posits resurrection as the foundation stone of reality often leapfrogs loss. Like, part of why I love having the Lord of the Rings as my secondary religious world is because it counterposes the triumphalism of Christianity to me. It reminds me that I don't get to just jump from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. The loss is loss. The death is a real death, right? Like there's the Lord of the Rings is in some ways a more effective theology of the cross, at least in terms of personal experience, and a lot of explicitly Christian theology. And I think that relationship to grief and loss is so fundamental to what it is, to how it works, to its its theopoetics, its theological reality. The fact that it is a fantasy allows it to do this. There's so much more I could say. If only your listeners had 3 more hours for me to fully explain all that I want to about this. But I will leave it at that, is that I think The Lord of the Rings is a story about loss and how to live in the midst of it, and to live a meaningful life in its wake, and taking up loss as, if not, how do I put this? Oh, damn. I was gonna quote a song from the late 90s, but I can't even remember the Closing Time. Do you know the song Closing Time by
Oh,
Semisonic?
of course. Oh, of course.
I'm trying to remember the exact lyric from that. It's like, every beginning is some other beginning's end, something like that.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, okay. Well, there you go. That's the Lord of the Rings. So you can just play that over the ending credits. I'm sure you've got the rights cleared for that. Do the little montage at the end of the podcast. Christ.
Spoken like a true millennial. If you just want to understand the Lord of the Rings, go listen to a 90s pop jam.
Indeed. All of that is simply to say that I think that a text like The Lord of the Rings is not a replacement for religion, but I think it can be a really important, it can do religious work for you. And I think you need to be as reflexive about that as you are about your relationship to your own primary world faith, if you have one, or your own just fundamental commitments about yourself and the nature of reality. But I have found in my life, and in the lives of my participants, and in the lives of the people I talk to, that The Lord of the Rings is just as capable of doing that. And in some ways, it has gifts to give that are very difficult to find within most forms of Christianity that I've encountered. And that's, as I say in the book, in the thesis, I'm a Christian and I love Tolkien, and I need both of them. They're not the same thing. They do different things. They're not incompatible, but I need both of them to live a more meaningful life. Your mileage may vary, but that's where I come down.
Ah, man. I love everything you said. I appreciate just you bring your expertise, your personal experience, and your passion to the conversation and the questions. And I just appreciate your time, Tom. This has been like way too much fun. And I guess before we go, like, where can people find you on the internet? Where can they find your work? And maybe, what are some, obviously you just got done with the PhD, so obviously no hurry, but what anticipated projects can they look forward to from you?
Sure. Well, I'd also like to thank you for the opportunity to chat, Nick. It's always a pleasure to hang out. And I hope that your listeners had as much fun as we did, although I must apologize for my perhaps Tolkienian tendency to ramble at length. As for where you can find me, my sporadically updated newsletter is at Substack, queerandback.substack. And I'm going to be posting there. Actually, was working on a piece there for that today, now that I'm finished with the PhD and I'm in a little bit more of a position to keep folks abreast of what I'm up to. And you can find me at realtomemanuel.bluesky.social, which is if you want to follow me on social media, that's the one where I'm most active. And yeah, beyond that, I'm not going to say too much about what I'm working on just because things are kind of in the pot at the moment. But I will say that my upcoming project is titled Fascism and Fairy, Fantastic Antitheses. And it's about the shared roots of Tolkien, the legendarium, and fascist movements of his day, and specifically about why this very specific this very thing I've been talking about, this idea of secondariness and disenchantment and the passing away of the enchanted world of the text when you finish reading it, subverts attempts to make his work into a right-wing propaganda machine. That despite that there are very real similarities between some of the things that Tolkien and the fascists were doing, and I don't think we should shy away from this uncomfortable reality of that, and that the nature of Tolkien's project is radically opposed to theirs, and that the very structure of his fictional world itself subverts right-wing appropriations of it. You and I and your listeners are more than familiar with the kind of right-wing appropriations we're talking about. So that's the current project. That's got a couple of different prongs to it, but you can look forward to a little bit more about that, hopefully in the short-term future.
Sick, dude. Yeah, sounds like it's going to be much needed and super spicy. But yeah, everyone, I will have links to all of Tom's stuff that he mentioned, and then as soon as Tom's dissertation pops up on the University of Glasgow's website, I'll find a way to link that so people can read your research, and then I'll just anything that that you do, Tom, I get stoked on. So, and I will definitely share with the listeners. So everyone, go read Tom's stuff. Go find him on the internet so you can keep track of what he's doing.
Yeah, and thanks again, Nick. I'm really grateful for the work you do here and for your own work in Tolkien scholarship and the Tolkien community. Much love to y'all. Stay safe out there. Stay sane. Until next time. God bless.